You were never really one of us, Emily. Grandma just felt sorry for you. That's what my sister said to me, standing in the parking lot of Whitfield and Koss Attorneys at Law, 11 days after our grandmother's funeral, holding a manila folder against her chest like a shield. My brother stood next to her, arms crossed, not even looking at me. The will had just been read. $340,000 in liquid assets, a paid-off house on Larchmont Avenue, and a 22% stake in the family's old hardware store chain, all of it split two ways, between Vanessa and Derek. My name wasn't on a single line. Not the house, not the store, not even the modest life insurance policy Grandma had kept since 1994. 29 years old, and according to the document, a lawyer had just read out loud in a wood-paneled office that smelled like burnt coffee and old paper, I had been erased from my own family's history like a typo. One remembered the exact sound the paper made when the attorney set it down on the conference table afterward, that small, final slap of a document that had already decided everything before I'd even walked into the room. I remember my own hands, folded in my lap, perfectly still, while somewhere under my ribs something was breaking apart in complete silence. What none of them knew, what none of them could have known, sitting there so satisfied with themselves, was that my grandmother had called me 4 days before she died, her voice thin but clear, and said 9 words I would replay in my head for the rest of my life. Check the ledger, Emmy. The real one's mine. Paul Koss had read the document in a flat, practiced voice, the kind lawyers must learn specifically for moments like that one, pausing only once, right after the line naming Derek and Vanessa as equal beneficiaries of the house, to glance up at me over his reading glasses, as if some part of him expected me to interrupt. I didn't interrupt. I sat with my hands folded in my lap and let him finish every line, all the way through the final clause, because some instinct in me, some old lesson from a kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of yellow receipts, told me that the worst thing I could do in that room was react before I understood the entire shape of what I was looking at. My name is Emily Hart. I'm 29 years old, and at the time all of this happened, I was living in a one-bedroom apartment on 5th Street in Millbrook, Ohio, working as a forensic accountant for a mid-sized firm that did contract work for 3 regional banks and, occasionally, for family estates tangled up in disputes just like the one I was about to walk into. I want to welcome you back if you've watched my other stories, and if this is your first time here, thank you for stopping by. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened in my family, step by step, with the real numbers and the real words that were said, because I think a lot of you have lived some version of this. If you have, drop the word ledger in the comments when you get there, and stay with me, because what my grandmother did in the last 4 days of her life was smarter than anything her lawyer, her son, or her other 2 grandchildren ever gave her credit for. I need to back up about 26 years to explain how we got to that parking lot. My grandmother's name was Eleanor Whitfield, though everybody who loved her just called her Nell. She was born in 1939 in a farmhouse 40 minutes outside of Millbrook, the third of 5 children, and she used to tell me stories about growing up without indoor plumbing until she was almost 12. About walking 2 miles to a one-room schoolhouse in boots her mother resoled every winter with scraps of leather from her own father's cobbler shop. She met my grandfather, Walter Whitfield, at a county fair in 1957 when she was 18 and he was 21, and they married the following spring in a small church that no longer exists on the north side of town. Walter opened the first Whitfield hardware store in downtown Millbrook in 1963. And Nell kept the books by hand at the kitchen table every night for the first 11 years, long before there was any real money in it, long before anyone would have called it a family legacy. By the time Walter died of a heart attack in 1988 at only 52 years old, there were 4 Whitfield hardware locations spread across 2 counties, and Nell ran the business herself for another 6 years before finally handing day-to-day operations to a hired manager. Though she never once stopped reviewing the books personally, every single month right up until the year she died. She had 2 children, My father, Richard, born in 1961, and my aunt Carol, born in 1964. Both of them went to college on money Nell made herself, no loans, no debt, and both of them, in different ways, spent their adult lives a little uneasy about how much they owed her for it. My father died when I was 6 years old, in a construction accident on a job site outside Dayton in the fall of 2000, and my mother, Diane, not to be confused with our old neighbor Diane Prescott, which I'll get to later, never really recovered her footing after that. She remarried a man named Gary Holt 2 years later, and when Gary got a job offer in Scottsdale, Arizona, my mother packed up the house within 6 weeks and moved with him, taking my 2 older siblings, Derek, 11 at the time, and Vanessa, 8, and leaving me behind with Nell just for the summer, she told everyone, until things settled down out there. Things never settled down. I was 8 years old that summer, and I ended up living with my grandmother, full-time, for the rest of my childhood. That single fact, that I was raised inside the house on Larchmont Avenue, and Derek and Vanessa were raised 4 states away with our mother and stepfather, became the fault line that cracked open everything else that happened in this story. I don't say that with any bitterness toward my mother anymore. I spent a long time being angry with her, and somewhere in my 20s I let most of that go, especially after she called me, unprompted, the week after the funeral, crying, saying she was sorry she'd ever let it happen the way it did. But I need you to understand the shape of it because it explains so much of what came later. Nell never once treated me like a guest in her own home, and she never let me feel like I was a burden she'd been saddled with. I remember specifically the winter I turned 9, when I asked her outright, lying on the living room floor doing homework, whether she'd rather I went back to my mom so she didn't have to deal with me. She put down the dish towel she was holding, sat on the floor next to me even though her knees ached, and said, "Emmy, I buried my husband and I buried my son. You are not a chore I'm doing. You are the reason I still get up in the morning." I was 9 years old, and I didn't fully understand what she meant. I understand it completely now. She taught me to balance a checkbook at 11 years old, sitting at that same kitchen table where she'd once kept the hardware store's books by hand. A calculator and a stack of yellow receipts spread out between us. She used to say, "Numbers don't lie to you, Emmy. People do. Learn to read the numbers and you'll never be fooled twice by the same person." I didn't understand then how literally I would need that lesson one day. She paid for 2 years of community college and then the balance of my tuition at Ohio State, where I earned my accounting degree in the spring of 2016, graduating with a 3.81 GPA and a job offer from a Columbus firm before I even walked the stage. Nell sat in the 3rd row at that graduation, 81 years old, wearing a green dress she told me later she'd bought specifically for the occasion at a shop on Grover Street. Derek sent a card. Vanessa didn't send anything at all. I want to give you 3 specific scenes from those growing up years because I think they explain the whole dynamic better than any summary could. The first happened at Christmas in 2006 when I was 12. Derek and Vanessa flew in from Scottsdale for 8 days, and Nell, wanting all 3 of us to feel equal, bought each of us the exact same gift, a $100 savings bond, plus one additional, more personal gift chosen just for that child. Mine was a set of graphing calculators for school. Derek's was a $150 pair of basketball shoes. Vanessa's was a $200 charm bracelet. I remember standing in the kitchen afterward, not upset about the gifts themselves, but overhearing my mother on the phone with Nell a few days later saying, "You always give Emily the practical stuff because she's the responsible one, but the kids out here need more, Mom. Life is more expensive in Arizona." Nell never said no to that framing, not once, not for years, and I think that's the moment the pattern of Emily needs less, because Emily handles herself first got quietly written into the family's operating logic long before anyone put a dollar figure on it. The second scene happened in the summer of 2009 when I was 15. Derek, 23 at the time and living in Scottsdale, called Nell and asked her for $18,000 to cover a down payment on a duplex he wanted to flip. She wired it to him within the week, no paperwork, just trust, the way she trusted all of her grandchildren by default. I remember being in the room when she took that call, and afterward she looked at me and said, almost apologetically, "He's trying to build something, Emmy. That's worth helping." I nodded, because I believed her, and because at 15 I had no framework yet for what worth helping would come to cost. The third scene came 2 years later, in 2011, when Vanessa, 21 and freshly graduated from a small college outside Tempe, asked Nell for $9,500 to cover what she called wedding expenses for an engagement that, as it turned out, ended 4 months later. Vanessa called it off herself and kept every dollar of the money. Nell never once asked for either sum back from either of them, but I watched her, more times than I can count over the years that followed, hang up the phone after one of those calls, walk to the roll-top desk in the study just off the living room, and open the bottom drawer where she kept a green cloth-bound ledger, the same kind she'd used to track inventory at the very first hardware store back in 1963. She'd write the amount, the date, and the reason in the same careful cursive she used for everything, and she started calling it, half joking, half serious, the family accounts. I saw her do this at least a dozen times growing up. I never once opened that ledger myself. I thought it was just an old woman's habit, a leftover from her bookkeeping days. I was wrong about that, and it would matter more than almost anything else in this story. I should tell you a little about Aunt Carol and Marcus here too, since they both matter later in this story. Aunt Carol moved to Cincinnati in 1986 for her husband's job and never moved back. And though she and Nell spoke on the phone every Sunday for as long as I can remember, she'd always kept a certain polite distance from the day-to-day tangle of Derek and Vanessa's requests for money, telling me once, years later, "I learned a long time ago not to get between your grandmother and her checkbook." Marcus, her son, was 3 years older than me, and we'd been close as small children before geography pulled us apart, reconnecting mostly at holidays and the occasional reunion. He'd always had a quieter, more observant temperament, the kind of person who noticed things at a family gathering that everyone else talked right over. I mention this now because it's exactly that temperament that made him the one who eventually called me, unprompted, about what Derek had asked him to do. There's an earlier scene, too, from when I was 13, in the spring of 2007, that I think set the tone for everything that came after it. Derek and Vanessa were visiting for spring break, and one afternoon, Nell took all 3 of us to the original Whitfield hardware location downtown, the one Walter had opened in 1963, to show us the old ledgers he'd kept by hand in the 60s before she'd taken over the bookkeeping herself. Derek and Vanessa wandered off within 10 minutes, bored, to look at the display of pocket knives near the register. I stayed, and Nell walked me through page after page of my grandfather's handwriting, telling me stories behind different entries, a customer who paid in eggs and firewood during a lean winter in 1965, a competitor who tried to undercut them on nails in 1971 and failed within a year. She said, closing the ledger gently, "This is how you know a business and a family is really doing all right, Emmy, not by what people say about it, by what's written down." I was 13. I didn't know yet how much that sentence would matter. A fourth scene happened when I was 17. In the spring of 2011, the same season, Vanessa asked for her wedding money. I'd been accepted into a summer pre-college accounting program at Ohio State that cost $800, and I remember standing in the kitchen, working up the nerve to ask Nell for it, my hands sweating, because even at 17, I already hated asking her for anything. She didn't even let me finish the sentence. She wrote a check on the spot, then looked at me and said, "Emmy, you know you don't have to flinch every time you ask me for something, right?" I said I knew. I don't think either of us fully believed it. I think some part of me had already absorbed, without anyone ever saying it out loud, that my worth in that family was tied to needing less than my siblings, and that if I ever needed more, I might lose whatever quiet provisional belonging I'd built for myself inside that house. A fifth scene, and maybe the one that stayed with me longest, happened at my father's grave on the 10th anniversary of his death, in the fall of 2010 when I was 16. Nell drove me out to the cemetery on the north side of town, just the two of us, the way she did every October without fail. Derek and Vanessa never came for those visits, not once in all the years I lived with her, even though they'd known our father far longer than I had. Standing at that headstone, Nell took my hand and said, "He'd be so proud of the person you're turning into. I hope you know that's not because you're the one who stayed. It's because of who you are." I've held onto that sentence through every ugly moment that came later, because it's the clearest proof I have that whatever happened at the end of her life wasn't really about who stayed or who was practical. It was about something she saw in me that had nothing to do with convenience. By the time I was 22, working my first real job at the accounting firm and still living 10 minutes from Nell, the pattern had become impossible for even me to ignore. I remember sitting at my desk one afternoon in 2016, a few months into that first job, running a routine debt-to-income ratio for a client and catching myself, almost as a private joke, running the same rough math on my own family, using nothing but memory. Even with imperfect numbers, even before I'd ever seen the ledger itself, the shape of it was already obvious to me on a legal pad during my lunch break: two grandchildren who asked often and received generously, and one grandchild, me, who almost never asked at all. I didn't tell anyone about that lunch break exercise for years. I think some part of me was embarrassed by how clearly the pattern showed up the moment I actually looked for it. Vanessa, then living back in Ohio after her second broken engagement, asked Nell for $14,000 in 2017 to fund what she called a business opportunity, a multi-level cosmetics company that collapsed within the year, taking Nell's money with it. Derek, who had moved back to Columbus by then, asked for $27,000 in 2018 to buy out a business partner in a landscaping company that folded 18 months later. I never once asked Nell for a dollar past the point I started earning my own income. I want to be honest with you about why. It wasn't because I was somehow more noble than my siblings. I think, if anything, I was more afraid of being told no, and even more afraid of owing anyone anything, especially the one person who had never once, not for a single day of my life, made me feel like a burden. Here's the number I want you to remember, because it comes back later and it matters more than anything else I'm about to tell you. Between 2005 and 2022, according to that green ledger, Nell gave Derek and Vanessa a combined total of $214,600 in cash gifts, loans that were never repaid, and co-signed debts she quietly paid off herself when they defaulted. I received, in that same 17-year window, exactly $6,200. All of it for my college books and a car repair in 2015, both logged in that ledger, both requested by me directly, both fully disclosed to my grandmother out loud. No secrecy involved on my end, ever. So when Derek stood in that parking lot after the will reading and said, with a completely straight face, "Grandma always said family should be treated equally," I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing out loud, because I had just spent 17 years quietly watching what equal actually meant depending on which grandchild happened to be asking. Now let me tell you how it actually escalated, because the will reading wasn't the beginning of this story. It was the end of a 5-year campaign, and I didn't understand the full shape of it until it was almost too late to do anything about it. The first real betrayal I can point to happened in March of 2019. Nell had a fall in her kitchen, nothing broken, just a bruised hip, but it scared all three of us badly. Vanessa, who by then had moved back to Millbrook and was living rent-free in the small guest house behind Nell's main property, used that fall as an opening. In small comments spread out over months, she began positioning herself as the grandchild who was present, while quietly suggesting that I had drifted, that my career had made me distant, cold, more interested in numbers than in people. She told Nell, more than once according to Nell herself, "Emily's just too busy with her career to really be there for you." This was strange, considering I was the one who drove Nell to her 7:40 a.m. hip x-ray the very next morning, before my own 9 o'clock meeting at work, while Vanessa slept in until 11. It was a subtle campaign. It was also completely false, but repeated often enough, subtle lies start to sound, even to the person being lied about, like observed and reasonable facts. The second incident came in October of 2019 when Derek convinced Nell to add his name as a joint signer on one of her 3 bank accounts. The operating account for the hardware store's remaining single location, worth roughly $61,000 at the time, under the reasoning that someone needs financial access in case anything happens to you, Mom. Nell agreed, trusting him completely, without ever consulting a lawyer first. Within 4 months, according to bank statements I would later pull with her written authorization, Derek had transferred $22,000 out of that account into his own personal checking, describing the withdrawals in the memo line, each and every time, as management consulting fee, a service he was never contracted for, never licensed to provide, and never once asked by Nell to perform. The third incident happened in the spring of 2020, when Vanessa convinced Nell to let her handle just the mail and the bills during the early months of the pandemic, since Nell was in the highest risk category for the virus, and Vanessa lived on the property already. Over the following 14 months, 3 of Nell's medical bills went to collections, not because there wasn't money to cover them, but because Vanessa, by her own later admission to me, forgot, while somehow never once missing a payment on the $340 a month car lease Nell had co-signed for her the year before. The fourth incident, in January of 2021, was the one that first made me start paying real attention. Nell mentioned to me, almost in passing over dinner one Sunday, that Derek had suggested she consider updating her estate plan to reflect current family realities, and that he'd recommended a lawyer, a man named Paul Koss, who Derek had met through his landscaping business contacts. I asked her, gently, whether she wanted me to look over anything before she signed it, since it was, after all, exactly the kind of document I dealt with professionally. She waved me off, saying, "Paul's a good boy, Derek says he's fair," and I let it go, which is one of the very few decisions in this entire story I still wish I could take back. The fifth incident came in August of 2021. Nell called me, upset in a way I'd rarely heard from her before, because Vanessa had asked to borrow $31,000 against the equity in the Larchmont house to invest in a friend's restaurant, and when Nell hesitated for the first time in years, Vanessa reportedly said, in front of Nell's next-door neighbor Diane Prescott, "You'd do it for Derek without blinking." Why is it different for me? Nell gave her the money 3 weeks later. Diane told me this exact detail herself, over a year afterward, sitting on her own porch with a cup of coffee, because by then she felt guilty for never having said anything at the time it happened. The sixth incident, in March of 2022, was the first time I actually saw a document with my own eyes that genuinely troubled me. Nell asked me to help her organize some paperwork. She trusted my job for exactly this kind of thing. And in a folder labeled Estate 2022, I found a draft will, dated 4 months earlier, prepared by Paul Koss's office, that divided her estate into 3 roughly equal parts, my name included alongside my siblings. I said nothing to Derek or Vanessa about it, but I made a copy of that draft that same afternoon and kept it, dated and time-stamped, in a folder of my own at home. The seventh incident, that same summer of 2022, involved a family reunion at Aunt Carol's house in Cincinnati, the first time all of Nell's grandchildren and great-nieces and nephews had been in one place in almost 6 years. Derek gave a toast that day too, an early rehearsal, in hindsight, for the one Vanessa would give at the birthday dinner 8 months later. He raised his glass and said, "To Mom, who's always known how to take care of the people who really need it." Several relatives clapped. Aunt Carol, sitting beside me, leaned over afterward and said quietly, "That's an odd way to phrase a toast to your own mother," the only sign that whole afternoon that anyone else at that reunion had registered something slightly off in Derek's words. I sat there and said nothing, because I didn't yet have the language for what was happening to me in front of a room full of people who thought they were watching a nice moment. The eighth incident, in September of 2022, was when Nell's health took a real and frightening turn. A mild stroke, hospitalized for 6 days at Millbrook General. During those 6 days, while I sat in that hospital room every single evening after work, sometimes until 11 at night, Derek and Vanessa were, according to hospital visitor sign-in records I later requested through the estate proceedings, present for a combined total of 40 minutes across the entire 6-day stay. 40 minutes combined across 6 days. I was there for something closer to 31 hours over that same window. One of the nurses on that floor, a woman named Rosa Delgado, actually commented to me on day 4, not knowing anything about our family dynamics, "You must be the granddaughter who lives close by. She talks about you a lot." I didn't correct her by explaining that I was, in fact, the only grandchild who lived within 2 hours. The ninth incident involved my cousin Marcus, Aunt Carol's son, who lived 2 hours away in Cincinnati and rarely came around, but who called me out of nowhere in February of 2023 to say that Derek had asked him months earlier to back up a story that I had once asked Nell for $15,000 toward a car and never repaid it. A complete fabrication, since I have never in my life owned a car that cost anywhere close to that, and never asked Nell for anything beyond the $6,200, fully documented in her own ledger. Marcus told Derek he wouldn't lie for him, and Derek reportedly told him to just stay out of it then. Marcus called me not to warn me exactly, but because it had been eating at him for weeks and he didn't know what else to do with it. On that call, he said, "I don't want to get in the middle of whatever's happening between you three, Em, but I couldn't sit on that one. It didn't feel like something small." I thanked him and told him honestly that I didn't yet understand what it meant either, only that it confirmed a feeling I'd been carrying for months without being able to name it. The 10th incident happened in late September of 2022, right after Nell was discharged from that 6-day hospital stay. Derek flew in for what he called a family planning weekend, and he brought a printed spreadsheet. My spreadsheet training, ironically, was the only reason I recognized the formatting at all as something built to look more official than it was, laying out what he described as a fair path forward for Mom's care, which proposed that Vanessa be paid $1,900 a month out of Nell's own accounts as a family caregiver stipend, despite the fact that Nell still had a part-time home health aide, Rosa's colleague from the hospital's referral network, covering the actual physical care 3 days a week. Nell, still weak from the stroke and wanting peace in her house, signed off on it without asking me to review it first. I only learned the exact figure 8 months later, going through bank statements during the estate dispute. The 11th incident came in October of 2022 when I offered, gently, to set up a shared online calendar and a simple shared spreadsheet so all 3 of us could track Nell's appointments, medications, and expenses transparently, the way I would have set up bookkeeping for any client managing an aging parent's affairs. Vanessa responded in the group text with, "We don't need Emily turning grandma into an audit," and Derek followed it with a laughing emoji. I let the idea go. I look back on that exchange now as the clearest moment where transparency itself was treated as an attack, which, in hindsight, told me everything I needed to know about what was being hidden. There was also a quieter pattern running underneath all of this, one that didn't fit neatly into a single dated incident, but that I think is worth naming anyway. From 2019 onward, Vanessa posted regularly on social media about caring for grandma, photos of herself at the Larchmont house, captions like "so grateful for these years together," and "not everyone gets this kind of time with the people who raised them." Friends and distant relatives commented constantly about what a devoted granddaughter she was. I was never in those photos. I wasn't tagged, wasn't mentioned, wasn't visible in that version of our family's story at all, despite being there more nights of the week than she was. I didn't say anything about it for years, partly because I don't spend much time on those platforms myself, and partly because I told myself it didn't matter what strangers online believed about our family. Looking back, I think that quiet, curated public narrative did real work. It built a version of events witnessed by dozens of people who'd never once set foot in that house that made Vanessa's later claims of being the present grandchild feel independently corroborated, when in fact it was corroborated by nothing except a phone camera and a caption. A 12th incident, that same October, involved a conversation I only learned about secondhand, almost a year later, from Rosa Delgado. She told me that during one of the home health visits, she'd overheard Derek on the phone in the hallway outside Nell's bedroom, saying to someone, "Likely, Vanessa, we just need her stable long enough to get the paperwork finished, then it doesn't matter." Rosa said she didn't think much of it at the time, assuming it was about insurance paperwork or a medical directive, and only mentioned it to me later, almost as an afterthought, once she understood what the paperwork had actually referred to. A 13th incident, closely tied to the 12th, happened at that same December dinner, later in the evening, after I'd already overheard Derek and Vanessa in the next room. Nell asked me, out of nowhere, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of decaf between her hands, whether I still had that old calculator she'd taught me on as a girl. I told her I did, that it sat in a drawer in my apartment, that I could never bring myself to throw it away. She smiled and said, "Good. Numbers stick with you longer than people sometimes do, Emmy. Don't ever lose that habit." I didn't know, sitting there, that she was quietly rehearsing the exact instinct she'd soon be counting on me to use. A 14th incident happened in December of 2022 when I brought homemade dinner over to the Larchmont house on a night Vanessa and Derek both happened to be present. The first time all three of us grandchildren had been under that roof together since the family reunion in Cincinnati. Nell seemed thrilled, telling me twice how happy it made her to have her kids together. At one point while I was washing dishes, I overheard Derek and Vanessa in the next room, their voices low, Vanessa saying, "We should just get her to sign it before Christmas while she's in a good mood," and Derek answering, "Cass said the earlier draft's basically ready, we just need the appointment." I didn't understand the full weight of that conversation until months later, but I remember standing at that sink with soap on my hands, feeling something cold settle into my stomach that I couldn't yet name. The 12th incident, and the one that finally showed me the full shape of what was happening, came in November of 2022, 5 months before Nell passed. I learned, through an accidental phone call from Paul Cass's paralegal, who had the wrong number written down and dialed me by mistake, instead of Vanessa, that a new will had been signed on November 14th. This one splitting the estate only between Derek and Vanessa, with a typed note in the file stating the change was made at the specific request of Eleanor Whitfield, due to concerns about equitable distribution given prior gifts already received by E. Hart. I sat in my car outside my apartment for nearly 20 minutes after that call ended, staring at the steering wheel because I finally understood, completely, that someone had taken my grandmother's own honest ledger, the one meant to track what she'd already given Derek and Vanessa, and twisted its meaning into a story where I was somehow the grandchild who had received too much. I want to pause here, because this is the point in the story where you need to remember something my grandmother told me back in the summer of 2016, right after my college graduation, the two of us sitting on her back porch with sweet tea, years before any of this began. I'd asked her, half joking, why she still kept that old ledger by hand when everyone had bank apps and spreadsheets now. She looked at me for a long moment, and she said, "The quiet ones remember best, Emmy. Don't ever forget that." At the time, I thought she was just talking about herself, about her own memory, her own habit of writing things down. I didn't understand yet that she was talking about me too. If you've ever had a family member rewrite the story of your own generosity or your own patience into a story about your greed, I want you to comment the word ledger right now, because we are far from finished, and what's coming next is worse before it gets better. I want to ask you something honestly while we're at this halfway point together. Has anyone in your own family ever taken the very thing you gave quietly and turned it into evidence against you? If so, you already know the particular kind of disorientation I felt sitting in my car outside that apartment building, and I promise you, staying with me through the rest of this story is going to matter. In January of 2023, 3 months before Nell died, there was a stretch of about 5 weeks where things almost felt normal again, and I want to tell you about that honestly, because I think it makes what happened next hurt even more. Vanessa invited me to Sunday dinner at the main house, something she hadn't done in over a year, and made a lasagna from scratch, the same recipe Nell had taught both of us as kids. And for one evening, we actually laughed together about something stupid, an old story about Nell chasing a raccoon out of the garage with a broom back in 2003. Derek called me twice that month, once just to ask how work was going, no request for money attached, no tension in his voice at all. Nell seemed brighter, stronger, walking to the mailbox on her own again for the first time since the stroke. On one of those Sundays, she pulled me aside in the kitchen while Vanessa was in the other room and squeezed my hand and said, "This is nice, isn't it? All of us together again." I said it was, and I meant it, and for a while I let myself believe that whatever cold current had been running under our family for years had finally passed, that maybe the stroke had scared everyone into remembering what actually mattered. I even told my coworker, Priya Anand, in the break room on a Tuesday afternoon, that I thought my family was finally figuring it out. I remember saying those exact words to her, leaning against the counter by the coffee machine, and she'd smiled and said she hoped it stuck. Then, on February 19th, 2023, at Nell's 84th birthday dinner, with 11 people at the table including Diane Prescott and 2 of Nell's old friends from church, Vanessa stood up to give a toast, and near the end of it, looking directly at me, she said, "And to family, the ones who show up, and the ones who just show up for the will reading." 11 people at that table went quiet all at once. Nell's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. I sat there with my face burning, and I said nothing, because I didn't want to make a scene at my own grandmother's birthday dinner. Derek laughed, actually laughed out loud, and said, "Come on, Van, it's a party." Nobody at that table corrected the record. Nobody mentioned that I had been at that house 4 to 5 nights a week for the past 2 years, while Derek and Vanessa split their time between a Scottsdale timeshare and a rental apartment in Columbus. Nell reached over under the table afterward and squeezed my knee, once, without a word, and I've thought about that small gesture more times than I can count since then. There's one more moment from that same dinner I need to tell you about, because I didn't understand its significance until much later. After the toast, once the room had moved on to dessert, Nell asked me quietly to walk her to the study just for a minute away from the noise of the table. Once we were alone, she opened the roll-top desk, looked at the green ledger sitting in its usual drawer, and said, almost to herself, "I've been thinking about fixing something, Emmy. I just need a little more time to do it right." I asked her what she meant, and she patted my hand and said, "Don't worry about it tonight. Go enjoy your cake." I didn't push. I've spent a lot of hours since then wishing I had pushed, just a little, that night in the study, though I've also come to accept that she was already, quietly, building the plan that would eventually become the letter I'd find behind that water heater 5 months later. The false lull was over. What came next was worse than anything that had come before it. On March 30th, 2023, 4 days before Nell was hospitalized for the last time, I stopped by the Larchmont house on a Thursday evening to drop off her prescriptions from the pharmacy. Vanessa answered the door, and before I could even get inside, she told me, flatly, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, that Nell had decided it would be healthier if I gave the family some space, that my visits were confusing her and stressing her out, and that Derek and Vanessa thought it would be best if I called ahead from now on rather than just showing up unannounced. I stood on that porch, holding a white pharmacy bag with Nell's blood pressure medication inside it, and asked to speak to her directly, just for a minute. Vanessa said she was resting and couldn't be disturbed. I left the bag with her and drove home, and I cried in my car in the parking lot of my own apartment building for almost 40 minutes because for the first time in 21 years, I had been told I wasn't welcome in the one house that had always been my home. 4 days later, Nell had the stroke that put her in the hospital for the final time. I found out from Diane Prescott, not from my own siblings, nearly 6 hours after it happened. The ultimatum came on April 2nd, 2023, in the hospital hallway outside Nell's room at Millbrook General, room 412, at roughly 6:15 in the evening. Derek pulled me aside while Vanessa sat inside with Nell, and he said quietly, almost gently, in a tone that somehow made it worse than shouting would have, "Look, Em, nobody wants this to be ugly. If you come in there and start stirring things up about the will or the accounts, you're going to upset her in her final days, and that's on you. If you just let this play out the way it's supposed to, we can all still be a family after. But you push this, and you're choosing to be alone." I remember every word because I wrote it down in my phone's notes app in the hospital parking lot 20 minutes later, my hands shaking so badly I had to retype half the sentence 3 separate times before it came out right. I sat in that parking lot until almost 8 o'clock that night, unable to make myself drive home, replaying every version of what I could have said back to him, and hadn't. What made it worse was that 20 minutes before Derek pulled me aside, I had actually been allowed into the room to see Nell, briefly, and she had squeezed my hand and asked whether Derek and Vanessa were getting along okay with each other, worried, even in that state, about keeping the peace between her grandchildren rather than about herself. I told her they were fine. It was the last lie I ever told her, and I have never fully forgiven myself for it, even knowing now what she'd already quietly set in motion behind all of our backs. I went back to the hospital twice more before she died, both times calling ahead as Derek had instructed, both times kept to short, supervised visits with Vanessa present in the room the entire time, watching the clock. I understand now, looking back, that those 4 days were not really about protecting Nell's peace at all. They were about controlling what she heard. And from whom, in the narrow window before whatever final arrangements, Derek and Vanessa believed they still needed to lock into place. Nell died on April 6, 2023 at 3:52 in the morning, at 84 years old, with Vanessa in the room and Derek in the hallway and me 40 minutes away, stuck at a red light that felt like it lasted an hour, because Vanessa had texted me the news instead of calling, and I hadn't seen the message until I'd already left work for the night. The will was read on April 17th, 11 days later, at Paul Koss's office, and that's where this story started, with Vanessa in the parking lot telling me I was never really one of us, with Derek not even looking at me, with $340,000 in assets split 2 ways between 2 people who between them had given my grandmother 40 minutes of hospital visits during her worst week, and who had asked her, across 17 years, for $214,600 they never repaid a cent of. But 4 days before she died on April 2nd, the same day as Derek's ultimatum in the hallway, Nell had called me from her hospital bed at 9:47 in the evening, her voice thinner than I'd ever heard it, and she'd said, "Check the ledger, Emmy. The real one's mine." I asked her what she meant, and she said, "The green one, not the copy. Mine's in the lockbox behind the water heater taped up under the shelf. Only you know where the spare key is." Then she said she was tired, and we said goodnight, and it was the last real conversation we ever had. I didn't understand what she meant that night. I understood fully about 6 weeks later. I want to tell you what those 6 weeks in between felt like, because they were their own kind of quiet suffering. I went back to work 3 days after the funeral because I didn't know what else to do with myself. I sat through the will reading, feeling like I was watching it happen to someone else. I didn't sleep more than 4 hours a night for most of May. Priya covered 2 of my client meetings without me even asking her to, just because she noticed I wasn't myself. I kept hearing Nell's voice in my head over and over, check the ledger, Emmy, the real one's mine. And I kept telling myself I was too raw, too exhausted, too afraid of what I might or might not find to go back to that house and look for it. I went through the motions of that spring almost mechanically. I still drove past the Larchmont house some evenings on my way home from work, slowing at the corner of the block, without ever actually turning in, just to look at the porch light Nell always left on, still burning out of habit because nobody had thought to change the timer. I found myself, more than once, dialing the first 3 digits of her number before remembering. I went to a grief support group at the community center on Route 12 twice that May, sat in a circle of folding chairs with 6 strangers, and said almost nothing both times, because I didn't yet have language for what I was grieving, not just Nell, but the version of my family I'd let myself believe in for those 5 weeks in January, the lasagna, the raccoon story, the 2 calls from Derek with nothing attached. Losing that illusion felt, some days, almost as sharp as losing her. It took me 5 weeks to work up the nerve. The discovery happened on May 30th, 2023, 5 weeks after the will reading, on a Tuesday evening when I finally worked up the courage to go back to the Larchmont house. Vanessa and Derek were still living there at the time, sorting through Nell's belongings before the eventual sale. But Vanessa was out of town for the weekend, visiting a friend in Cleveland, and Derek, when I called to ask if I could come by for a few of Grandma's things, said yes without much thought, probably assuming I meant a sweater or a photo album. I went straight down to the basement, to the water heater closet, and I found the loose panel under the shelf exactly where Nell had said it would be. And taped up behind it, I found a small metal lockbox, the paint chipped at one corner. Inside was the spare key on a ring with a faded blue ribbon, exactly as she described it to me over the phone. I didn't open the lockbox that night, sitting alone on the cold basement floor of a house that no longer fully felt like mine. I want to be honest with you about what that felt like. It wasn't triumphant, not even a little. It was one of the loneliest moments of my entire life, kneeling on that concrete floor, keys in my hand, grieving a woman I had loved more than anyone else on this earth, while also bracing myself for whatever truth was about to come out of that box. I thought, for one strange second, about the version of Nell who taught me to balance a checkbook at 11 years old, and I wondered if she'd known, even then, that one day I'd need every bit of that training just to protect myself from her own children's children. I sat there for almost 20 minutes before I finally unlocked it. In those 20 minutes, kneeling on that basement floor, I thought about the conversation in the study at her birthday dinner, the one where she'd said she was thinking about fixing something. I thought about the 90-year-old roll-top desk upstairs, empty now, its drawers cleared out weeks earlier by Vanessa to make room for new furniture, and I understood, with a kind of quiet horror, that if Vanessa had cleared that desk even 1 week earlier than she had, this lockbox might never have survived long enough for Nell to tell me where to find it. I thought about the raccoon story from that Sunday dinner in January, about Nell teaching me to balance a checkbook at 11, about her hand on mine at my father's grave. Grief and dread sat in my chest at the exact same time, in a way I don't think I have ever fully found words for since. Inside was the real green ledger, the original, not the sanitized copy Paul Koss's office had apparently used, or been given, to justify the final will. And clipped to the inside front cover was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in Nell's careful cursive, dated March 28, 2023, 5 days before the ultimatum in that hospital hallway, 6 days before her final stroke. It read, "To whoever finds this, Likely Emily, since she's the only one who ever asked me honest questions instead of asking me for money. This ledger records every gift, loan, and co-signed debt I have given to Derek Whitfield Hart and Vanessa Whitfield Hart since 2005, totaling $214,600. None of it repaid, none of it disclosed by them to Paul Koss when he drafted the November will. That will was prepared based on their claim that Emily had already received her share through years of free housing. I want the record corrected. I am setting aside a separate account, opened privately at 3rd Millbrook Trust on March 15, 2023 account, ending in 4,471, in Emily's name alone, funded with $180,000, the exact amount needed to make the total distribution across all 3 grandchildren finally truly equal. This was never about punishing Derek or Vanessa. It was about the truth finally being written down somewhere they couldn't erase it. Emmy, the quiet ones remember best. I love you. Nell. I sat on that basement floor and read that letter 4 separate times before I could bring myself to stand up. I remember calling in sick to work the next morning, the first time I'd done that in 3 years, because I simply couldn't function well enough to sit through client meetings. I told Priya everything 2 days later, sitting in her car in the office parking garage, because I didn't trust myself not to cry at my desk. She listened without interrupting for almost 20 minutes, and when I finally finished, she said only, "Emily, you have to use this, not to hurt them, just because it's true, and true things are allowed to matter." I've thought about that sentence more times than I can count in the months since. I called Marcus that same week, and when I read him Nell's letter over the phone, he was quiet for a long moment before saying, "That sounds exactly like her. She always did her real talking on paper." He offered, without my even asking, to testify to what Derek had asked him to do if it ever became relevant to the estate proceedings, and though it never ended up being legally necessary, knowing he was willing to say it out loud, on the record, meant more to me than I think I let him know at the time. I spent the following week and a half doing exactly what my training had prepared me for. I contacted the branch manager at 3rd Millbrook Trust with the account information and a copy of Nell's death certificate, and confirmed the account was real, funded, and legally structured as an individual account, naming me as sole owner, not part of the general estate. I had the handwritten letter examined and authenticated by a forensic document specialist my firm had worked with before, a careful, soft-spoken man named Gerald Okafor, who spent 3 hours comparing the letter against 14 known samples of Nell's handwriting, spanning from 1971 to 2022, pulled from old hardware store inventory sheets, greeting cards, and the ledger itself. He called me himself once he'd finished and said, "I don't say this often, but this is about as clean a match as I've ever seen. Same pressure pattern on her descenders, same particular way she crosses her sevens. Whoever wrote this letter, it was her, and she wasn't shaking when she wrote it." I confirmed the handwriting matched multiple known samples of Nell's writing from her hardware store ledgers going back decades. I had it notarized the following week by a public notary, a woman named Fatima Rashid, who worked out of a small shipping and notary shop near my office, who witnessed my own signature and formally logged the chain of custody, asking me plainly, as she stamped the final page, whether the document was connected to a dispute, since she said she liked to note that context in her own log for her records. I told her, honestly, that it was connected to my grandmother's estate. She paused, looked at me for a moment, and said, "I hope it says what you need it to say," before finishing the stamp. I also pulled the full transaction history on the hardware store's operating account going back to 2019, using the limited authorization Nell had given me years earlier when she'd added me, quietly, as a backup viewer on several of her accounts, just in case, a fact I don't think Derek ever knew about. Cross-referencing those withdrawals against the ledger entries took me the better part of 4 evenings after work, laid out on my kitchen table with color-coded sticky notes, the same way I'd organize any contested estate file for a client. I built a single-page summary sheet, dates down one column, amounts down the next, ledger entry references beside each, because I know from years of professional experience that a room full of people under emotional pressure will absorb a clean, simple table far better than they'll absorb a stack of raw bank statements. Only once all of that was in place did I request the meeting. The confrontation happened on June 9, 2023, 10 days later, in the same conference room at Paul Cass's office where the original will had been read 7 weeks earlier. I requested the meeting myself, in writing, citing a discovered asset that had not been disclosed to the estate. Derek and Vanessa were both there, along with Paul Cass himself, and I brought 3 things with me: the original green ledger, a certified bank statement showing the $180,000 account at Third Millbrook Trust in my name alone, and a printed copy of Nell's handwritten letter, notarized the week before. I laid the ledger on the table first and opened it to the earliest page, dated 2005, and said calmly, "This is the original financial record my grandmother kept for 17 years. It documents $214,600 in gifts and unpaid loans to the 2 of you. I'd like to walk through it, page by page, because I believe the November will was drafted using incomplete information." I turned to the page for 2009 and read Derek's $18,000 duplex loan out loud. The date, the amount, Nell's own handwriting. Vanessa's face went white. Derek said too quickly, "That ledger doesn't prove anything. That's just an old woman's notes. She wasn't always clear-headed at the end." I turned the page to 2018 and read his $27,000 landscaping loan out loud next, then turned to 2019 and read the $22,000 he'd transferred out of the hardware store account under the label management consulting fee, and asked him directly, still calm, "Can you tell me what consulting services you provided the store that year? I can pull the operating records if it would help you remember." He didn't answer that question. I turned another page and read Vanessa's $31,000 restaurant investment from 2021 and asked her the same kind of question: how much of that money had ever been repaid, or the restaurant itself, which had folded within a year. She didn't answer either. I wasn't finished. I turned to the page for the caregiver stipend arrangement from September of 2022 and read the $1,900 monthly figure out loud, then looked at Vanessa and said, "Rose's colleague was already covering the physical care 3 days a week. Can you walk me through what the stipend was compensating for?" Vanessa said, "I did things Rose's colleague didn't do. I managed her whole life." And I said, still calm, "That's fair. And if that's true, it should be easy to show me. Do you have any record of hours, tasks, anything at all?" She didn't have anything. I turned another page to the $22,000 management consulting fee from Derek's hardware store withdrawals and asked him plainly, "What consulting deliverables did you produce for the store that year? An inventory review, a marketing plan, anything in writing?" He said, "It doesn't work like that between family," and I said, "Then it wasn't a consulting fee, it was a withdrawal, and I think we should call it that in front of Paul." Paul didn't disagree. I turned one more page back to the 2017 entry for Vanessa's $14,000 cosmetics investment and read the line where Nell had noted in her own handwriting at the time, "V says will repay from profits. No profits materialized, no repayment requested." I asked Vanessa quietly whether she remembered that conversation with Nell. She said she didn't, though her eyes told me otherwise. Then I said, still calm, "She was clear-headed enough to call me 4 days before she died and tell me exactly where to find this, and clear-headed enough to open a private account at Third Millbrook Trust 9 days before her final stroke. Here's the statement." I slid the bank document across the table. Vanessa's voice cracked as she said, "This is insane. You're twisting this. Grandma loved us. She wouldn't do this to us." And Derek cut in over her, louder now, his voice rising for the first time, saying, "You've been planning this, haven't you? You probably poisoned her against us for years, sneaking around behind our backs the whole time." I let him finish. I didn't raise my voice once. I said, "I was at that house 4 nights a week for 2 years, while the visitor logs at Millbrook General show the 2 of you spent a combined 40 minutes with her during her final hospital stay. I have that record too, if you'd like to see it." Paul Koss, to his credit, had gone pale several minutes earlier, and he asked to examine the original ledger and the notarized letter directly. And after nearly 15 minutes of silence while he read, he said quietly that his office would need to formally review the November will's validity given this newly discovered financial disclosure discrepancy, and that he personally had not been informed of any prior gifts to either Derek or Vanessa at the time he drafted it. Vanessa started crying at that point, not the kind of crying that comes from grief, but the kind that comes from being caught, repeating, "This isn't fair, this isn't fair," she said, "we'd be taken care of." While Derek stood up so fast, his chair scraped hard against the floor, jabbing a finger across the table toward me and saying, "You think a piece of paper makes you the good one here? You think this makes up for years of you acting better than us?" I said, quietly. "I never said I was better than either of you. I said the truth got left out of a legal document, and now it's back in it." That was the only time my own voice shook at all during that entire meeting, and even then, it never once rose above a normal speaking volume. Derek left the room without another word. Vanessa stayed another few minutes, wiping her face, and said only, "I need to think," before she left too. Before I left that day, Paul Koss asked me to stay a moment longer, and he said something I didn't expect. He told me that in 26 years of estate law, he'd learned to ask every client directly whether any beneficiary had received prior significant gifts, and that he had asked Nell that exact question during the November drafting session. According to his own file notes, Nell had answered, "Emily's had less than the other two, not more," and Derek, present in the room, had interjected before Paul could follow up, saying something like, "Mom, you know that's not really true anymore. Remember the housing thing," steering the conversation before Paul could clarify further. Paul said, quietly, looking almost embarrassed, "I should have pushed harder in that moment. I didn't. I'm sorry." It wasn't an admission that changed the legal outcome, but it was the first time anyone involved in that November will had acknowledged, out loud, that the record hadn't been built cleanly. What followed the confrontation was 11 months of formal estate litigation, and I want to walk you through at least the shape of it, because it wasn't one dramatic day in court the way movies make it look. It was a slow, grinding process of filings, a court-appointed guardian ad litem-style review of the estate's financial history, 2 separate mediation sessions that went nowhere, and a final probate hearing in May of 2024. At the first mediation session, in August of 2023, Derek's attorney argued that the third Millbrook Trust account should be folded into the general estate and split 3 ways, since it had been created so close to Nell's death. I sat through that session mostly in silence, letting my own attorney, a woman named Renata Ibsen who specialized in contested estates, do the talking, presenting the notarized letter and the authenticated handwriting analysis as evidence that the account had been deliberately and independently established outside the will, specifically to correct a documented imbalance. The mediator, a retired judge named Harold Weiss, ultimately recommended in his written opinion that the account be recognized as separate from the estate, a recommendation both sides' attorneys treated as strongly predictive of how a judge would eventually rule if the case proceeded to trial. The second mediation, in January of 2024, focused on the house and the store stake, and it was there that Derek and Vanessa's attorney proposed the settlement that eventually held. The house and the store stake would remain divided between the two of them as originally listed in the November will, since overturning that portion entirely would have required proving the will invalid in its entirety, a higher legal bar than the specific, narrower question of the third Millbrook account. Renata explained to me, plainly, that pursuing a full invalidation would likely take another year and tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees, with no guarantee of a better outcome, and that the $180,000 account, already legally secure, represented Nell's own deliberate correction rather than something I needed a court to hand me. I chose to accept that settlement in February of 2024, not because I felt it was perfectly fair, but because I understood, the way Nell had once taught me to read a balance sheet, that some numbers you can spend years fighting to change, and some numbers you accept because the fight itself starts costing more than what's left to win. The aftermath wasn't clean, and I think it's important I tell you that honestly, because too many of these stories end with a neat bow on top, and mine didn't. The $180,000 account was legally recognized as a separate, validly established asset outside the contested estate, since it had been opened and funded independently by Nell weeks before her death, with clear documentation and no evidence of undue influence, according to the estate attorney who eventually reviewed it on the court's behalf. The original hardware store stake and the house on Larchmont Avenue were left in ongoing dispute for 11 months, eventually settled with Derek and Vanessa retaining the house and store stake exactly as originally listed in the November will, since that portion of the estate plan, however influenced by their own misrepresentations, was still ruled procedurally valid by the court, but the account Nell created specifically to correct the imbalance came to me in full, untouched, exactly as she designed it. Derek has not spoken to me since that meeting on June 9th. Not a call, not a text, not so much as a birthday card the following February. I ran into him once, 7 months later, at a gas station off Route 9, both of us filling up at pumps across from each other on a gray Sunday afternoon. He looked at me for a second too long enough that I almost said his name, and for just a moment I thought he might actually cross the small stretch of pavement between us. He didn't. He got into his car without a single word, and I stood there holding the pump handle, watching his taillights pull out onto the road, feeling something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite relief, just a flat, heavy quiet where a brother used to be. Vanessa reached out 4 months after the confrontation, in October of 2023, with a long text message that was half apology and half justification, saying she was sorry it got so ugly, but that she still believed she and Derek deserved what they got, given how much time they'd sacrificed living near Nell in her final years. I didn't respond for 11 days. When I finally did, I told her I was open to talking, but only in person, and only if she was willing to actually listen instead of explain. We met for coffee once in January of 2024 at a small place on Grover Street, the same street where Nell had bought that green dress for my graduation. Vanessa stirred her coffee for almost a full minute before saying anything at all, then finally asked, quietly, "Do you think she was disappointed in us at the end?" I told her honestly that I didn't know, that Nell's letter hadn't been about disappointment so much as correction, that it read to me like a woman trying to fix a math problem rather than punish two people she loved. Vanessa nodded, didn't say much else, and near the end of our 40 minutes together said, "I don't think I can undo the last 5 years. I don't know how to say sorry for something that big." I told her I didn't need her to undo it. I just needed her, someday, to stop explaining it. She hasn't quite gotten there yet. It was stiff and careful and nothing at all like Sunday dinner in 2003. We've spoken maybe 6 times since then, always briefly, always a little guarded. I don't know if that relationship will ever be what it was when we were kids taking turns on Nell's tire swing in the backyard. I've made peace with the possibility that it might not. My cousin Marcus, the one who told me about Derek asking him to back up a lie, has stayed close since all of this happened. He and I talk almost every week now, and he came to visit my new house last spring with his 2 kids, and it's one of the few family relationships that actually grew stronger out of the wreckage of that year. Diane Prescott, our old neighbor, still lives next door to the Larchmont house, and she and I have coffee every couple of months. She told me once that watching this whole thing unfold from her porch made her finally sit down and write her own will clearly in plain language with no ambiguity left for anyone to exploit later. Paul Koss's office, for what it's worth, implemented a new internal policy the following year, requiring full financial disclosure statements from all named beneficiaries before any estate plan revision could be finalized. Paul told me himself, almost apologetically over the phone, that my case was part of the reason why. Aunt Carol, my father's sister, called me the week the dispute was finally settled and said only, "Your grandmother always said you were the one who'd actually read the fine print." I don't think she meant it as a compliment back then. I think she does now. My mother called me 3 separate times in the months after the confrontation, each time trying, in her own imperfect way, to talk about what had happened. On the 3rd call, in November of 2023, she finally said the thing I think I'd been waiting to hear for 21 years: I should never have let you become the one who stayed while they became the ones who got everything. That was on me before it was ever on them. We talk once a month now, sometimes twice, and it's not the relationship I had growing up, but it's more honest than it used to be, and I've decided that has to count for something. Rosa Delgado, the nurse from Nell's hospital stay, sent me a card that fall, having heard through a mutual contact at the hospital how things had turned out, and it simply said, "She was right about you." I keep it in the same drawer as the ledger. Paul Casas, paralegal, the one whose wrong number call first tipped me off to the November will, later told me, at a chance meeting at a coffee shop, that she'd felt uneasy about that file from the day it crossed her desk because Derek had been present in the room for the entire signing appointment, coaching Nell's answers to Paul's standard disclosure questions in a way she said didn't sit right, though she hadn't felt it was her place to say anything at the time. I don't hold that against her. I think, if anything, her discomfort was one more quiet signal, among many, that something in that room hadn't been right, even to the people who had no reason to take my side. The hardware store itself, the 22% stake Derek and Vanessa now jointly hold, was sold outright to a regional chain in the spring of 2024, 11 months after the estate settled, for a figure neither of them has ever told me directly, though Marcus mentioned it was a lot less than they were expecting once the lawyers took their cut. I felt nothing when I heard that. Not satisfaction, not sympathy. Just the strange, flat feeling of watching something that used to be my grandfather's life's work get reduced to a line item on someone else's balance sheet. I want to be honest about the parts of this that never fully resolved, because I think that honesty matters more than a tidy ending. There are nights, still, almost 2 years later, when I catch myself reaching for my phone to call Nell about something small, a recipe I can't quite remember, a question about an old family story, before I remember she's not there to answer. I went through a stretch in the fall of 2023, about 4 months after the confrontation, when I barely spoke to anyone outside of work and Marcus for nearly 3 weeks. Not out of anger, just a kind of bone-deep exhaustion that grief and legal proceedings together seemed to produce. Priya noticed, the way she always seemed to notice things, and one Friday she simply showed up at my apartment with soup and sat with me for 2 hours without asking me to explain anything. I don't think I properly thanked her for that until almost a year later. I'm thanking her again now, on camera, because some debts aren't financial, and I don't ever want to leave them unspoken the way so much in my family was left unspoken for years. I also want to say something about Derek and Vanessa that isn't purely condemnation, because I don't think either of them started out as villains in some simple sense, and I think stories like this one do a disservice to their own lessons if they pretend otherwise. Derek, growing up 4 states away, has told me, in rare, unguarded moments over the years, that he always felt like the backup child after our father died, like Nell's attention and resources had permanently shifted toward the family that stayed nearby. I don't think that feeling justified what he did, but I understand now that it's probably real to him and that some of what drove those withdrawals wasn't pure greed so much as a decades-long fear of being forgotten by the one steady source of stability in a childhood otherwise scattered across 2 states and a stepfather's household. That understanding doesn't undo the $22,000. It just makes the whole story sadder than a simple villain would. Vanessa, for her part, once told me, back in that January stretch of false peace in 2023, about the 2 broken engagements that had defined most of her 20s, and how our mother had told her once, offhandedly, that she worried Vanessa would end up alone, the way some women just do. I think Vanessa spent years afterward terrified of being the failed one, the unmarried one, the one who couldn't hold a life together the way she believed everyone expected her to, and I think, in some warped way, Extracting money and reassurance from Nell became her way of proving she still mattered to somebody. That fear was real too. It still doesn't excuse the restaurant investment, or the toast at the birthday dinner, or the porch conversation that told me I wasn't welcome in my own home. But I don't think either of my siblings woke up one day and decided to become the people they became in this story. I think fear, left unexamined for long enough, can look a great deal like cruelty from the outside. What I built afterward, though, is something I'm genuinely proud of, and I think it's the part of this story that matters most. I used a portion of the $180,000, not all of it, I want to be clear about that, because I'm not interested in pretending the money solved everything on its own, to put a down payment on a small house on Cedar Lane, 8 minutes from where Nell used to live. I kept her green ledger. It sits on a shelf in my study now, right next to a framed photo of the two of us at my college graduation, her in that green dress she bought special for the day. Every year, on her birthday, I write one page in a new ledger of my own, not tracking money, but tracking the people in my life who showed up quietly without ever asking for anything back in return. Marcus, Diane, Priya, Rosa, the nurse who noticed things nobody else did. I started doing pro bono forensic accounting work twice a year for a local nonprofit here in Millbrook that helps elderly residents protect themselves from financial exploitation by their own family members, because I never want another 84-year-old woman to have to hide a lockbox behind a water heater just to make sure the truth survives her. Last spring, I sat across from a 79-year-old widow named Doris Kellerman, walking her through exactly how to structure a transparent, hard-to-manipulate account for her own grandchildren. And when I explained why I knew how to do this so precisely, she reached over and squeezed my hand the exact same way Nell used to, and said, "Someone taught you well, honey." I told her she had no idea how right she was. I also framed a second document alongside the photo from my graduation that I don't think I've mentioned yet, a single page, photocopied, of the very first entry Nell ever made in that green ledger, dated August of 2005, 4 months before I turned to age 11 and long before I understood any of what it would come to mean. It reads simply, D. 4,200, truck repair, not asked to be repaid, but noted. 18 years of quiet, careful notation start on that page. I keep it because it reminds me that the truth in my family was never hidden. It was just written down in a place nobody bothered to look, by a woman everyone assumed was too old, too soft, or too sentimental to be keeping score. She was keeping the only kind of score that ever actually mattered. The house on Cedar Lane isn't grand. It's a 3-bedroom brick ranch built in 1974 with a kitchen I've slowly renovated myself, one weekend project at a time. Over the past year and a half, new counters in the spring of 2024, refinished cabinets that fall, a small built-in desk in the corner where I now keep my own accounts, the same way Nell once kept hers at that roll-top desk in the study. I planted a garden along the back fence my first spring there, mostly tomatoes and the same variety of marigolds Nell always grew along her own porch, because some habits are worth carrying forward even when the person who taught them to you is gone. Marcus helped me hang shelves in the study the week I moved in, and it's on those shelves that the ledger, the letter, the framed graduation photo, and Rosa's card all sit together now. A small, deliberate archive of the people who told me the truth when it would have been easier for them to say nothing. I still work at the same accounting firm, though I was promoted to senior associate in early 2024, partly, my manager told me candidly, because the partners had heard through the local legal community about how I'd handled the discovery and authentication of the ledger and the letter, and wanted more of that kind of careful, methodical work on the firm's more complicated estate files. I've taken on 4 contested estate cases since then, in a professional capacity, each one different in its details, but all of them, in some fundamental way, about the same thing. Families where the loudest version of events tried to overwrite what actually happened, and where somebody, somewhere, had kept a quiet, honest record that eventually cut through the noise. I don't take those cases lightly. I know, better than most people my age probably do, exactly what it costs the person sitting across the table from me to lay their own family's financial history out in the open in front of strangers. The nonprofit work one mentioned, the twice-yearly sessions with elderly clients working through their own estate documentation, has grown into something a little larger than I originally expected. I've now walked 11 different clients through the same basic exercise. Write down every significant gift in plain language as it happens, dated and specific, whether or not you ever expect repayment, because the record itself is what protects the people you actually intend to protect. Doris Kellerman, the widow I mentioned, calls me every few months just to update me on her grandchildren, and last winter she sent me a card that included, tucked inside, a small color-coded ledger of her own, modeled loosely on the description I'd given her of Nell's green notebook. She'd titled the first page, in her own careful handwriting, "The Kellerman Accounts, started because Emily Hart taught me better." I still drive out to that cemetery on the north side of town every October, the way Nell once drove me out to visit my father, except now I go alone, and I visit 2 headstones instead of 1, standing between them for a few minutes each time before I say anything out loud. Last October, on the first anniversary that fell after the estate finally settled, I brought the green ledger with me just to have it close, and I told her, quietly, standing there in the cold, that I'd finally stopped flinching every time I had to ask for something, that I understood now what she'd meant on that back porch in 2016, that I was trying, in my own small way, to make sure nobody else in this town ever had to hide the truth behind a water heater to protect it. I think about what my grandmother said to me on that back porch in the summer of 2016, years before any of this ever started, and I understand it completely now in a way I simply couldn't back then. The quiet ones remember best. She was talking about herself, and she was talking about me too. And in the end, that quiet, patient habit of writing things down, of refusing to let the loudest version of a story become the only version anyone remembers, was the exact thing that made sure the truth outlived her, even when the people closest to her tried their hardest to bury it in a lawyer's office with a straight face. If you've ever been the quiet one in your own family, the one who showed up without being asked, who kept things running without ever needing credit for it, I want you to know that being quiet was never the same thing as being weak, and it was never, ever the same thing as being forgettable. I spent most of my 20s believing that keeping the peace meant staying silent, that being the responsible one meant absorbing whatever version of the story everyone else agreed to tell. I don't believe that anymore. I believe now that the responsible thing, the loving thing, is to write your own truth down somewhere durable, in your own hand if you have to, long before you ever need it, because you never know which 4 days at the end of someone's life might be the only 4 days left to make things right. I think, too, about the fact that none of this ever would have mattered if Nell hadn't spent 17 quiet years writing down small, unglamorous numbers in a cloth-bound notebook that nobody else in the family thought was worth a second glance. There's a lesson in that for anyone who's ever felt like the boring one, the practical one, the one who keeps records instead of making memories. Sometimes the record is the memory. Sometimes the plainest, least celebrated habit in a person's life turns out to be the exact thing that protects everyone they loved, long after they're no longer around to explain themselves. Comment the word "remember" below if this story meant something to you. Share it with someone who's ever been told they didn't belong in their own family, and subscribe if you want to hear the next one, because there are more stories like this one, and I think a lot of you needed to hear tonight that the quiet ones win in the end too.